This build is not for the faint of heart, or people without level 4 traders, or those who are poor. You will not be able to buy this gun. But we're going to build it anyway. So today we're going to build the best M4 that you can in Escape from Tarkov right now. For me, it's interesting to know where the limits are so that we can decide what the best build for us to run actually is, and knowing where the lowest recoil is versus the 90 recoil weapon base kind of frames the decision for us. So what we're going to do to start with is we're going to take the M4 and we're going to actually strip it back down right to the base, and we're going to build the minimum recoil M4 with the maximum ergonomics you can possibly get on it to kind of give us an idea of where we might get to on this weapon. I don't recommend using this build, but we can tweak it from there and get to something a little bit more sensible. But let's look at the theoretical best in terms of the stats first. So taking the lower, we have absolutely nothing on this whatsoever. We're going to start with the receiver. Let's open up the stats panel so we can see exactly what's going on. So we start with 48 ergonomics on the lower, and we've got vertical recoil of 147. As I've said previously, the recoil reduction in this game works off this number. So this number is reduced no matter how many attachments you've got. If something says 3%, it works off this number here to get you 3% reduction. So we're going to start looking at the uppers. Now you have the standard uppers, the M4 version and the ADAR version. And the best in slot here is the Ultor MUR upper. And this one you can see takes off 6 recoil. The other ones are not as good. The ADAR and the M4, that one gives 1, and these two give 3, both of them. The one that's actually decent for Ergo is this Noveska Gen 3, but we're not going to use that one in this case. We're going to use the Ultor. So this is a lot of level 4 stuff, which is the reason why this is so difficult to build if you're a lower level. Next one, because it's kind of an easy one, is on the pistol grip. There's a lot of different ones to choose from. Ultimately, you can put on one of these, which does both the stock and the grip, but just take it from me, it doesn't actually work out in the end because you can get a lot of ergonomics from the stock and you can get a lot of ergonomics from the pistol grip. So a combo doesn't actually work. It's not the best that you can get in this game. Now there's two. This one used to be the best one, this Ergo style PSG grip, but there was another version that was added which does exactly the same set of ergonomics, which is this growl, but it is slightly lower on weight, and so that makes it meta, I suppose. Not that it makes really any difference practically speaking, but you get a very slightly lower weight for using this. Onto stocks. So stocks for the M4, you have a choice of these buffer tubes. Again, none of the ones that attach directly. Some of them are okay for ergonomics or alright, but none of them get you to super low levels of recoil. Now, out of the different tubes, you have the Colt buffer tube, which is just for the standard M4, and the ADAR buffer tube. These two things are very, very similar, except the Colt one gives you -1 recoil, which is actually okay for the standard one. And then there's the STM as well for that new gun, which is also modular and fits with kind of other ARs. So the best one that you can get here is the advanced tube. Now there is actually one other better one, Mesa Cross, but that's not applicable for the Colt M4, so you can't use that. In theory, you can use the red one, which is very, very slightly better. I think you can see over on the left-hand side on the stats screen that your muzzle velocity is actually a bit higher. Your MOA, it doesn't actually make any effect here because we haven't added the barrel yet, so it's still 0.6, but your muzzle velocity is higher and your MOA is slightly better using this one. So we're just going to put it on just for silly games, but I would never actually use this because this is flea only and tends to be like 100,000 or something. Once we've got this on, then you've got the whole choice of the various other bits and pieces. You could just look through and see which one gives you the most recoil reduction, which is the PRS Gen 3. This one's not very good on ergonomics, which is the reason why a lot of people tend not to bother using it, but it does technically give you the minimum recoil, so we're going to use that. Onto bolts, this doesn't actually do anything other than ergonomics. As you can see, there's a couple of different ones here. These ones give you 3, and this one is the lightest, so it's 0.03 rather than 0.04, and so technically this one is the most meta one, so we're going to use that one. Next, we should take a look at barrels, obviously quite an important choice. We have a couple of different ones. We have the really super short one, which is not going to be very good for recoil. This removes 3. You then have the standard M4 370mm barrel, which removes 4 recoil. And then you have the AR-15-406, which is the ADAR one, which actually removes 6. So it's interesting that the ADAR barrel actually removes slightly more recoil than the M4 barrel. And if you're making cheap budget M4 kind of things and you're using an ADAR base, you actually get very slightly more recoil reduction just from keeping that ADAR barrel, even though the MOA isn't as good. As you can see over on the left hand side, you've got a bit of a red bar that's slightly bigger than for this one. But if you're looking for min recoil, either the 18-inch, which is -7, or -9 recoil for the AR-15. 20-inch barrel, which is the absolute longest one that you can get, is the one that you're going to be wanting to use. Now on handguards, these don't really give a huge amount of decrease in terms of the recoil reduction. Most of the time they're either 1 or 2% recoil reduction, and I think there's only 2. This is the SAI, which is the best in slot, which gives you 3% recoil reduction, which turns into 4 points on the M4. There's another one as well, which is the Mark 10, which again gives 4 points. This is the other 3% recoil reduction, and this one doesn't give you as much ergonomics, so we're going to stick with the SAI. Next one we're going to look at is gas blocks. This is relatively simple because there's only 2, I think, that fit to this one, and one has got less recoil than the other. And this one gives you -4 points of recoil, so we're going to stick that one on. So now we're at about 68, and we're getting there to the lowest recoil build. Handguards, as always, this hasn't changed for a very, very long time. You get these that can connect straight to it on the M-Lock, but using the M-Lock 4.1 inch, you can get the RK2 here. There it is. And this is the lowest recoil reduction grip in the game. This is now -4%. There is no other grip with -4%. So this is the best in terms of reducing recoil, but it does hammer your ergonomics, but we'll look at this a bit later. Now, as you can see here, we've got to 62, which is not really that great, and it just goes to show the fantastic power of the muzzle brakes on the M4. Now, there is so many to choose from, and this is always really quite annoying and quite complicated because so many of these that aren't just pure muzzle brakes have this suppressor attachment on the end, and you can't kind of compare one versus the other easily without adding one, adding the other, then changing it, adding one, adding the other. So I'll put up a little table because this is kind of the thing that I keep track of myself because it's so much easier to figure it out. If you've just got it kind of tabulated, you can just look at them. But they added this new one, the Silencer Co ASR, which is now the new best in slot when you attach the Seika ASR suppressor on the end. And this is where you go and jump from 60 something recoil down to 28, which is the min recoil at the moment for the M4 in Escape from Tarkov as of this patch 12.11, and is really honestly quite disgusting. Now, I'm surprised because I thought that Nikita and the team were trying to remove this kind of thing, but adding this compensator combo seems to actually have just made it even worse. This one's got 1 recoil reduction more than the previous best in slot and has 1 ergo reduction less than the previous best in slot. So I think this is an interesting choice, and the fact that you can get it this low is kind of strange. Now, 34 ergo is a little bit disgusting, so where can we boost the stats artificially to make this gun look a little bit more appealing? Well, one way, which is a bit of a cheat, is we can use the different magazines. Now, they tried to change this a bit so that you get a benefit for using very small mags, and there's one mag in particular, which is the Gen M3 10 rounder, which gives you 5 ergonomics when you use it. Now, this is kind of silly, right? Unless you're using this as a proper DMR or something, in which case, why do you need 28 vertical recoil? This is not a sensible configuration. But in terms of the pure statistics, it kind of starts to make it look a bit better at 39. So we're going to use that for the moment. The other 2 places that you can get a bit of extra ergo is by adding some of these sights. So you can use the Chris Defiance sight, which weighs almost nothing. You get 1 ergo on the front, and then also a Chris Defiance sight on the back, and you get another 1 ergonomics at the back. Now, there's one other thing that you can do here, which is if you add a very particular sight, which is the EKP, this gives you -2, but then when you add the shade back on the front, you get +3. So you actually get 1 ergonomics overall from using this Cobra. And this basically takes you to, I think, pretty much as high as you can get this. So you can get this now to 28 vertical recoil and 42 ergonomics, which doesn't sound actually that bad on paper. Obviously, you probably wouldn't want to use this weapon. It's a bit of a meme, but it just shows kind of what's possible and where you can get to. So now you might say to me, well, that's all well and good, but what are we actually going to do to this to make it something that's a bit more sensible? So if I had infinite rubles, what might I actually run on this weapon? Trying to get ergonomics and recoil to something that's kind of sensible, because we don't really need 28. We can forgo some of this to gain some extra ergonomics. Now, the usual place that I get rid of this is on the RK2, because if you switch this up to the shift, which has an incredible amount of ergonomics in comparison, you can see here we go from 28 to 31, I think it will be, unless there's some rounding, and we're going to go from 42 ergonomics up to 54 ergonomics, which is actually quite a big difference, and I think that probably is worth it. This is the reason why most people don't use the RK2. They use something else, either something in the middle, like a budget like RVG, or they use something kind of more meta-y, like either the shift or something like the Cobra, because that one's got 1 less ergonomics for basically the same recoil reduction. So that's why these grips end up being kind of decent, because you're talking about 2% recoil reduction rather than 4, and ultimately it doesn't actually make a huge difference to the overall feel of the weapon going from 28 to 31, but adding 12 ergonomics, that could actually make a big difference to you. I'm going to get rid of this scope because that's not really a thing. And then the PRS Gen 3, I never really use this stock either, because you can go for any of these MOEs, which are actually really, really decent. These I still think are the best in the game. I reckon that they forgot to add the butt pad on them, because on their own, they kind of seem to fit into the progression and the scaling fairly well. There used to be another one, which was the CTR stocks, which is this one here, which used to be better, but was only fine in raid. Well, now they've made it so the MOE ones are actually better than this once you add the butt pad on them. And so doing this, we now get to 32, so we lose 1 point of recoil, but now we're up at 60 ergonomics, which is really starting to get quite high. Clearly, we're using this 10-rounder mag, but I have an interesting thing that I want to show you here about this, which is why I haven't changed it out just yet. So one thing that I'm really interested in, and I actually think are quite underrated, are these 40 round mags. Now you go from, well, it's not -12, so if we get rid of it, we're at 55 ergo. And then if we try to add this 40 round mag, you only lose 7 ergonomics versus 3 of a standard. And I think those extra 10 rounds could actually make quite a big difference, because going from 7 to minus 16 on the drum is actually quite tough. And I think that as a min-maxer and trying to get to something that's really sensible and the best build that you can make kind of for the stats on there, these might actually be quite decent. Now, the big problem that you have is that they only fit into certain rigs. I'm going to pull up some of these on screen, but there's the TV110, the level 5 Osprey rig, and the AACPC, which all have 40 round mags on them. And these are ones that are, level 4, and then the 2 are level 5, which come with armor as well. You could also use the CSA, which is actually probably the cheapest choice, but you only get 2 3 slots and 2 2 slots. So you can find that there's a little bit of difficulty there in terms of reloads and stuff, because you can only really have one other 40 rounder. And if a 30 rounder goes in the 40 slot, you could end up dropping it and that kind of thing. So it's a bit annoying. The ANA Tactical is actually pretty decent, because this is quite a big rig and it doesn't interfere with your armor, so you can put whatever else you want on. I wish that they'd add a few more in here, because that would make the 40 rounders a bit more usable, I would say. But it is what it is, and it is possible to use it if you think about your kit a little bit. So depending on what you want to do with this, I think this build is actually quite decent. Obviously you need full level traders. I don't recommend anybody buying this stuff off the flea, because it's extortionately expensive, and having a weapon like this really is not necessary if you're trying to buy those parts off the flea market. But once you get to level 4 traders, you can potentially try this gun out, and there are other alternatives of this kind of thing that you can start to put together. Now, if you wanted to add something like an Elcan scope, this is going to take you down to 44 ergo and 32 recoil, which honestly is pretty insane. Really depends on what you want to do. If you just want a small optic and you're going to be playing kind of close to medium range, you could always use something like the Delta Point, which is my favorite, and that doesn't actually change any of your ergo stats at all, so you can keep your 48 with 32 recoil, which is awesome. And this gun would actually be really decent to run. You could swap out the advanced tube red version for the other one, but that doesn't affect any of the important stats, as we said previously. Now, the one other thing that I wanted to note here, which is kind of interesting, is whatever happens to the unsuppressed builds. Now, the problem that you have with the jailbreak, which is what I'm going to talk about, is that was actually nerfed slightly. And one of the major issues with it is that you can't use the 20-inch barrel with the jailbreak. The best one that you can use for the jailbreak, ironically, is actually the ADAR barrel. It has to be one of these shorter ones, and the ADAR barrel gives you slightly more recoil reduction than the M4, which is quite interesting. Now, for this, you have to use this handguard, because the jailbreak doesn't actually fit onto any other handguards. So this goes on here, and as you can see, it's modular and fixes onto the end. And we're going to have to replace the gas block because we got rid of the barrel, so we're going to put back on the J Enterprises. And then inside the jailbreak, you can put a certain subset of suppressors. You can really put any of them on, but you can't then put another silencer on afterwards. And so the best one that's standalone, which people just don't really use this because of the fact of combining suppressors and compensators together, is just way better most of the time. You use the Bulletech, which is the best for this in particular, and that gets you to 83 ergonomics and 37 recoil. So you can see if you want to build something that really is like super duper on ergo and is all right on recoil, you can go down this route instead. And this is a way that, if you want to run a 60 rounder or something, you could actually do that and still end up with ridiculous ergonomics, which is kind of cool. Even here, you could change this over to an RK1 or something, and you've still got 66 ergonomics and 35 recoil, despite having a 60 rounder on there, which is pretty neat. Now, there's one complaint on this usually, is that they're quite gassy. If you're using like a small optic like this, you're looking very much along the barrel length. Depending on the lighting condition, you get a lot of gas and smoke out of here. And so sometimes it can make it very difficult to actually see your target. But I thought it was interesting to note, the jailbreak can't get down to the levels of recoil that the suppressed builds can, but it's still a good one to have a think about. And, it's another potential. There's also the poor man's jailbreak, which I guess we should touch on, which is using the Furfrans. And that one here is the Furfrans muzzle brake. And then on top of that, you attach the concussion reduction device. And so this kind of acts in sort of a similar way. You end up with 43, so this isn't as good. Again, I'll pop up the thing in the corner so you can kind of see where it stands in and amongst the other attachments. But it's another interesting one to think about because this is a bit more budget. Although, again, some of the parts are at level 4, which does make it quite annoying to try and build these things early on in the progression, because a lot of the time they're either really expensive on the flea or you just simply can't buy them at all, which is a bit of a shame. But anyway, there's a couple of different builds and we can kind of see where we can get to if you were to build something that was semi or very close to meta. Enjoyed today's video and want to support the channel, please as always consider sending a like and a comment, as it helps with visibility for those who haven't found me yet on YouTube. You can follow me on Twitter and Twitch to check out when I'm live, which is currently 2 times a week, once on Friday at 9 PM UK time for the real-time recording of the Scav Talk podcast, which you can check out the link to in the description below, and a regular Tarkov stream on Saturday at 2 PM UK time in the afternoon. And with all that said, I'll see you next time, and as always, have fun in your raids.